Hi everyone, my name is Mercedes Morstead and my project explores the Indigenous people within Australia, sometimes referred to as the first Australians. So these people, they flourished across Australia before 1788. That's when British coloners arrived. I was so intrigued and surprised by the number of similarities between them and Canada's history with Indigenous, so I'll touch on that throughout the video. I want to give you an overview of their history and talk a little bit about their culture and the current injustices. And I also want to provide a little insight on how we could move forward with Indigenous people of Australia, because this relates directly to Canada right now too. So to clarify, I've read that there are over 500 different clan groups or nations with many different cultures and languages. And I want to study the Aboriginal people of whole Australia because I want to discuss how they are currently. So right now, there's only 2.4% of the population of all Australia, which are the Aboriginal people. So that's only about 460,000 out of the approximately 23 million people who live there. So to begin, I want to give a brief history, just to give you an idea of when colonization happened. So historians think that Australia's Aboriginal people were there in the continent first around 60,000 years ago. So this is similar to Canada, as the textbook we studied in class said that Aboriginals could have been there as early as 50,000 before present or even earlier. So remember that 1788, that's when colonization started happening. That's when they first went there. So this was in southern Australia. Late 1800s to mid 1900s, the government incorporated discriminatory legislation. So networks of institutions, state of control of families, and the removal of children. The Aboriginal family was deemed to be a site of danger and neglect for children who were to be removed by the state and trained for a future in white society. So does that sound familiar? This relates directly to residential schools within Canada. That was happening at the exact same time. And the way they worded that, Aboriginal family was deemed a site of danger and neglect for children. It did remind me of when I was listening to the podcast and on reading the textbook, it said the European view was that the First Nations here in Canada were somewhat of savages, and that they couldn't provide support for their children like the European society does. So that's exactly how they were looking at Australia at the same time. There are a few acts that are important and are similar to acts that we learned of taking place in Canada. So these are not really in depth, but it will give you an idea of what was happening. So there was a Aboriginal Protection Act in 1869, and this was, the government was regulating where Aboriginal people lived, their employment, and who they married. I find that interesting because it says Protection Act, even though that's really just controlling everything in their lives. In 1886, Victoria's Parliament passed what became known as a Half-Caste Act, and it started to remove Aboriginal people of mixed descent, known as half-castes, from the Aboriginal stations or reserves to force them to assimilate into white society. So this kind of reminded me of when we were learning about French marrying First Nations, and there were some who, once they did that, First Nations would lose their Indian status, so they wouldn't be able to collect the rights, and then they'd be assimilated to French culture instead. So the only difference is in Australia, they called it the Half-Caste Act, and they were removing people that were of mixed descent from reserves to force them to assimilate instead. There was an Aborigines Act in 1905, so that created the position of Chief Protector of Aborigines, who became the legal guardian of every single Aboriginal child to the age of 16 years. So it says that it created the position of Chief Protector of Aborigines. So they thought that they were protecting them from their livelihood and their cultures that they were growing up in, when really they were tearing them away from their moms and their families and their culture completely. So the Aboriginal child was the legal guardian of this chief protector up until 16 years and permitted authorities to send and detain Aboriginal children in institutions and in service work. So these children literally didn't grow up with their parents, and just like the children who went to residential schools in Canada, they weren't a part of their parents' lives like children should be. So there was an act in 1936 that went until 1964 that amended that Aboriginals Act of 1905. So this act said that the commissioner was the legal guardian of all Aboriginal children to the age of 21. So they actually extended the age, saying that a commissioner had legal guardianship. And they said in there that this is notwithstanding that the child has a parent. But the parent wasn't able to raise the child. So there was actual video footage of disease and the state of these children and adults that were working for the government. So these children that were taken away, and this was in 1956 at a place called Warburton, which the press and government basically ignored the video that was brought to them and said they were fine and that this was an exaggeration. So this place, Warburton, which is only one example of the places that they took the children for school and for working, this wasn't closed until 1977, so I found that interesting. It wasn't until 1967 that they removed references from the Australian Constitution that discriminated against Indigenous people and actually excluded them from being counted in the census. So after that, they were counted in the census as people. There was the Aboriginal Land Rights, a Northern Territory Act in 1976. This was the first attempt by the Australian government to legally recognize the Aboriginal system of land ownership and put into law the concept of inalienable freehold title. So it provided land for many Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, and this enabled them to maintain, in some cases, reestablish their cultural identity. As I was reading about this Aboriginal land rights, it seemed to be very, very difficult to do this, to acquire the land back, though. They had to prove that it was theirs at one point, so it took a lot of work from historians and anthropologists and people to prove that it was theirs, and it couldn't be owned by the Crown or even be of interest to the Crown for this to become available. So as a result of an amendment to this Aboriginal Lands Right Act by the Hawke government, no more land claims could be lodged after 1997. So this actually tells me that reconciliation was not yet taken seriously at all, because they opened it for a very small window, letting Aboriginal take back what really was not theirs in the first place, but was open for everyone to use until Europeans came to own it. And it wasn't until 1978 there was a Indian Child Welfare Act, which returned the control of children to the Aboriginal families and communities, and it set out guidelines for state agencies dealing with their children. So this was, it was partially a good thing in my eyes, only because they did return control of the children to Aboriginal families, but at the same time there was so much state agency control that there was still tons and tons of children getting taken away from their families. One of the reports I read said that some white people of Australia just didn't know the extent to which this was happening because of how the media put out perceptions of the Aboriginal people of Australia. And some just didn't know at all if they moved to Australia after all these major cultural genocide acts, because they were not being taught them. So this reminds me of my childhood growing up. I never learned of the severity of what Aboriginal people went through in Canada until university. I did know they lived here before and that Europeans came over and that residential schools did happen, but I never learned of the actual severity of what happened to their culture and why there are the struggles there are currently. They were unknown to me until university, until around the age of 18. So that's unacceptable in my eyes. This may have been exactly what happened to some Australians who grew up in the public education system before the 21st century. I know for a fact that things are changing because of the first-hand experience that I see in schools today as a teacher, not only teaching about what brutalities happen, but learning about Aboriginal culture, and to help reconcile and continue those efforts to keep trying and keep teaching every single class that comes about the history and the influence that it has today. So back to Australia, around 1970s. So until the 1970s, most of the immigrants in Australia came from Europe. So they pride themselves on being multicultural as Canada does. So now there's all these different people who live there similar to Canada. And they say in Australia that there are more than 300 languages spoken. English is their national language, but there are common languages like Mandarin, Italian, Arabic, Cantonese, and Greek. So imagine how many languages there would have been if the government had not supported a cultural assimilation and genocide in Australia too. Prior to European contact, there was around 250 languages already spoken there. This was already a well-developed and complex land, just as Canada was too when colonization happened. I found in an information booklet that says now only 1 in 10 Aboriginal people actually speak their Indigenous language in their home. And the government admits in saying that over 100 languages have been lost completely from before colonization of those languages, while 110 are still in danger. Among my research, I found a report called Bringing Them Home. So this is in 1997 now. And the findings were brought straight to the government, and it said that within this Bringing Them Home report, said that between 1 and 3 of every 10 Indigenous children had been forcibly removed from their families, and the litany of unhappy lives spent in institutions, foster homes, adoptive families, and forced employment rocked the nation. So there was tragic disclosures of ongoing medical, physiological, emotional problems, addictions, mental illness, incarceration, violence, self-harm, and suicide that haunted these stolen generations. So in Australia, they call it the stolen generations, all these people who were influenced by the schooling and the tearing of these children from their homes. Similar to in Canada, how people were affected by the residential schools. There's not really one term I can think of that it's referred to all the time for the people in Canada, but in Australia they're called the stolen generations. At the same time that this report came out, the Prime Minister that was from 96 to 2007, so this report came out in 1997, the Prime Minister John Howard, he was denying the whole idea of the stolen generations, and he argued that children's treatment was actually humane and standard for the time. I just couldn't believe when I was reading that that he reacted in that way and completely denied history for the whole nation. And that says something because people were watching him say that and influenced by his words. So this really horrific past makes me understand on a bigger level how so important it is to move forward with reconciliation, to teach people the truth, and in all countries that colonization tried to destroy and rid of First Peoples culture. I wanted to touch on an important step in both Australia and relating to Canada that the government took to move forward. So thankfully, in 2008, Kevin Rudd, so he was the new Prime Minister after John Howard, he made an impactful move and he nationally apologized publicly to the First People and stolen generations. This reminded me of when Stephen Harper made his apology in June of 2008, as well as for the treatment in residential schools. So I appreciated Harper's detail rather than Rudd's, which seemed to be a little more surface, but it was an apology nonetheless. Interestingly enough, Kevin Rudd made his apology before Stephen Harper, so I wonder if there was some kind of influence there. I'm currently taking a course in political studies, and there's a trend for things to catch on, or when one country does something, they have the feeling like they can do it because another country did it. So once Canada heard that Australia's Prime Minister was making these apologies, Canada's Prime Minister, Stephen Harper at the time, thought, oh, okay, well, maybe it's okay for me too. Oh, well, it was a good influence if it was that. Our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, also apologized on numerous occasions since then, which after going into the Prime Minister's position, I think was important for Aboriginals to hear from the current leader, to see that he also recognized what happened and is trying to reconcile and is trying to make things go forward in a positive way with their people. So action, I think, needs to follow words of reconciliation. The Australian government currently says that they're working closely with Indigenous Australians. And one example of this is the Indigenous Advancement Strategy that I found. And it provides a ton of programs and funds for jobs or land or the economy, children and schooling, safety, well-being, to enhance their culture and capabilities. And something that I found really important in there was that they were tailoring to innovative local solutions. So I think that's really important because just like Canada, there's so many diverse groups there and ecological situations from one side of Australia to the other. So I think different groups need different things, and this needs to be solved with different innovative ways. So our government, I think, should take note of that a little bit, only because we do live in a similar way that it's so different from one side of the nation to the other. After learning all this, it's hard to reflect without expressing how much sadness and heartbreak I feel towards the first people in Australia and Canada and all different places around the world that were under a cultural genocide by European explorers. And honestly, a little bit of frustration and anger, because now I'm living in this world where there's all these broken people that we're trying to reconcile with because of our ancestors who took these steps to tear these people apart. So the doctrine of discovery and religious rule of Christianity as excuses to take over land and cultures is just unbelievable to me. This is definitely going to affect not only the amount of information I share within the classroom, but I think the global connections I can now make and compare it to that will be important to the kids. Having this deeper understanding will help me meaningfully express to my students what kind of impact our history has made on the current conditions of people within Canada. Knowing there are other places in the world that are in a similar kind of reconciliation process gives me more hope for people, because we can also look towards each other for help and examples of what we can do to move the country forward positively with relationships to each other. Learning about all these places will be for the greater collective good, so we can ensure that history never repeats itself and we keep moving forward as a group of people, talking with Aboriginals, with them, not before them and not getting them to join in our plans, but talking with them to ensure that there's a continual revival of their culture. That's the end of my video. So thanks for listening, and I hope you learned a lot about the Aboriginal people within Australia.